An apology from me. My name's Tarun Khanna, and I had the time as 5:30, and I just did the fastest possible sprint from across the river over here, and I apologize for keeping such a rapt audience, even without you saying anything, Sunil.
Let's keep it that way.
Apologize for keeping you waiting. I thought I would, rather than read you their eminent bios, which have just been handed to me, I won't do that. I'll say something more personal, which is, I'm trained more as a mathematician and an economist and so on, but in graduate school I always dabbled much more widely. And I remember reading books by both these two stalwarts, or at least The Idea of India that Sunil had written by that time, and Ashu's book on Hindu-Muslim amity, social structure, is that, I forget the full title.
Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life.
Ethnic Conflict and Civic Life. So I remember both his books very well. And over time I've gotten to know Ashu very well and Sunil peripherally, so to speak. But I'm delighted to be over here, and I plan to fade away into the fabric of this room to leave it to these eminences. But I'm glad that the South Asian Institute is able to host this event, and I think it'll be very spirited. And I will play the role of a moderator and provocateur if necessary. If it becomes dry, I will say something controversial. And, but knowing Ashu and Sunil, I don't think it will be. So shall we just proceed apace, if you don't mind, and we'll try to make it as fun as possible. Who's going first? Did you have an agreed upon order? Khilnani, Varshney, K. All yours.
Thank you, Tarun, and thank you to the South Asia Institute and to the Graduate School of Design and the Loeb Fellowship for hosting us this week. My remarks are going to be very much informal and very much in the nature of remarks rather than a talk. I will leave things open-ended to help to get discussion going. It's been a normal week in Indian politics. Just to recap, for those of you who may not have been paying attention, we've had parliamentarians attack one another with pepper spray and rip up the speaker's mic, bringing the House to one of its not uncommon standstills. We've seen the government of the state of Delhi, headed by the new tyro of Indian politics, Arvind Kejriwal, and I'll talk more about him in a moment, resigning after 49 days in office. In his resignation speech, letting fly allegations of corruption against India's richest individual, the country's one true untouchable. We've seen one of the country's largest publishers volunteer to pulp a scholarly book on Hinduism because of offense it's claimed to have caused to religious sentiments. We've seen the creation of India's 29th state, more or less, amid street protests. And between all of this, of course, as usual, the two main national parties have continued to abuse one another. And we're still some 2 months away from national elections, so welcome to India's democracy. Yet for all its evident weirdness, the predicaments of Indian democracy, I think, have much in common with democracy's predicaments in other places. And what I'd like to do in the time I have this evening is to set out three thoughts, really, and a kind of one or two questions at the end of those. First of all, I'd like to suggest that the expansion of electoral competition, combined now with several decades of unprecedented high growth, have altered the horizons of political imagination in India. They've induced a kind of skepticism about the ancien regime and the legitimacy of its institutions and practices. And they've had the effect of making opinion and belief extremely volatile. Political authority is much more vulnerable in India today than I think it really probably has ever been for a long time. There's a deep shift, I think, in the nature of India's democratic politics, which alters the context or the environments in which institutions have to function. Second, the rise of, as it were, outsider challenges to the political system, whether in the form of national parties or indeed regional ones, is being driven by and indeed is part of this process. The skills that you now need to deploy in order to win legitimacy in India, to win elections, stand at a very wide remove from the abilities needed to operate the institutions of government. And thirdly, in terms of the emerging situation I've been tasked to address this evening, I think we're moving into a period where institutions of government are unlikely to function as they've been designed to. The legislative processes will be disrupted by minorities and so on. Governments will try to rule by ordinance, by personal fiat, or by acclamation, by voice votes, as happened yesterday. And I guess a couple of questions what will this mean for the conduct of government and policy, especially with regard to things like the economy? And perhaps more generally, is this a passing moment? As institutions recalibrate? Or is it the beginning of what might be quite an extended, new, different phase in the history of Indian democracy, making it more democratic, but in ways that political scientists, that social scientists, that liberals, I imagine many who, like many in this room, may actually find very uncomfortable. I'm not going to be able to fully substantiate these thoughts in what I have to say, but I'll try to explain, at least to briefly elaborate what I have in mind. And as I say, I hope this line of interpretation might get some discussion going. It's not, I think, a novel observation to note that across the world one can speak of a crisis of political representation. An inability of elected institutions and their members to perform their responsibilities because paralyzed by partisan divisions or by a variety of other reasons. And I think this has encouraged in many democracies across the world a sense that elected representatives are merely self-interested, they're self-serving, they're remote from, they're indeed contemptuous of those who elect them. We've seen populist movements on the rise in parts of the world, expressive of this disillusion with political and economic elites and with the inherited institutions of government. And this has indeed led to a more active role for non-elected institutions, which are seen often as providing a watch, a kind of oversight over the elected, and as such as having a greater legitimacy, somehow having an impartiality which the elected institutions are often seen as lacking. It's what Pierre Rosanvallon in some of his work has referred to as sort of monetary democracy with an I, not an E. But it's, a number of other people have obviously commented on this. And I think many of these non-elected bodies have willingly exercised their newfound powers, sometimes speaking directly to the citizenry, using the media, etc., speaking over the heads of elected bodies. And I see, so I think we've seen this kind of loss of faith in representative processes, and in many parts of the world, declining participation in electoral politics, or in politics more generally. I think all of these points could be taken to apply to India's democracy, except for the last one. In the most recent state elections held in last November and December, we've had record turnout figures in the 5 states that polled. Madhya Pradesh, 72%, Chhattisgarh, 77%, just over, Rajasthan approaching 78%, Mizoram, 81%, Delhi, 66%. It was only higher in 1972 in Delhi. I mean, these are extraordinary figures for state elections. At a moment when, as I've suggested, there's this other reaction happening. So I think we're seeing a society that's mobilized, that's not turning away from politics, but is engaging with it. And that mobilization, of course, is in part an expression of anger with the existing order, but it also, I think, signals the changing context in which politics is occurring, changing horizons of expectation, standards of assessment, and of norms. And norms is perhaps too strong a word, but changing standards because they are not yet fully formulated or articulated, but certainly changing standards of assessment. I think much of the academic debate about the effects of India's historically unprecedented growth rates over the past decade, but also now over 3 decades of around averaging 6%, has focused on whether growth is being pooled or whether it's trickling, whether there's increased or reduced inequality, all of which are, of course, important to know. But I think less attention has been given to the imaginative and psychological effects of this growth, and how it affects what I suggest is a democratic imagination. When while economic and social mobility remain rigid and limited, a new kind of mobility of the imagination, an imaginary mobility, if you like, has spread far and wide. The most extensive report we have of youth attitudes, which was done in 2008, found that over 80% expressed optimism about the future. And well over half, sorry, I've got these figures, they're not quite right, but certainly very, very high levels of the expression of high or very high aspirations about the future. With the youth in small towns having the highest levels of aspiration about that future, and indeed the highest levels of optimism about that future. These high expectations about the future need to, I think, be overlaid upon or connected to changes in the previous 2 decades and more that have been produced by the workings of democratic politics itself. Then if you add in to that the effects of new and social media, which further expose and puncture the protective routines of authority, you have an electorate which may still be largely non-literate, but it has a much more sophisticated understanding of politics than ever before. And I think the result can be seen in a kind of transformation, it can be seen as a transformation in the political psychology of Indians, a kind of still further corroding of structures of social deference and authority, something that's been happening through the electoral, the workings of the electoral process, but I think now has been much more accelerated by some of these other developments I've just noticed. The legitimacy of individuals and institutions has become much more, I think, fragile and volatile in a society where rules are in flux, rules of all kinds of things, whether rules about personal relations, about the family, about larger matters too, and where procedural rules that govern institutions are very unfamiliar, both to their new members, the new political entrants into state assemblies or parliament, and also unfamiliar to the citizenry. I think there's greater volatility of belief and opinion. It can change and flow, it can ebb or flow and change quite rapidly. And I think this change in how political authority and its routines are being seen alters in turn the conditions in which institutions have to operate. So the arms of government, parliament, political parties, politicians, public officials are all viewed with distrust. The paradox, of course, is that politics itself hasn't succumbed to that kind of cynicism, if you like. And it's that continued engagement with politics that's driving what in the past few months has really opened up into, I think, one of the most interesting electoral scenes in a long time. And of course, its interest doesn't specifically lie in its unpredictability. In fact, on the contrary, I think we're very much seeing, there's a feeling that we're seeing the last days of a kind of beleaguered, dysfunctional ancien regime. The question really is you know, how big is that defeat of that ancien regime going to be? How low will the numbers of Congress, UPA, etc. go? But I'm not going to get at all into the business of predicting any of that. It's really the nature of the challenge that's emerging, the nature of the challengers, which I want to just dwell on a little bit. Of course, the two who've emerged at the national level, Modi and now Kejriwal and they're obviously strong individuals, and they're fascinating, I think, to observe as individuals. But I also want to see them as expressions of this new moment as much as anything else. They're clearly both challengers who style themselves as outsiders. We're also in the curious situation where the man they're challenging, Rahul Gandhi, himself styles himself as an outsider within Congress. But then there's something to that, this need to kind of position oneself as an outsider in relation to the establishment. All of them, all three in this case, recognize their advantages to be had from appearing to be distant from the establishment. Modi himself plays off a kind of regional identity, his Gujarati identity, but even more than that, he extols his rise up from humble social origins. And also, above all, his complete commitment to politics and to a political life. I mean, again and again. So, you know, the fact that he left his wife very early on. The fact he's always the devotion to politics, I think, is an important part of his story. It's the story of an outsider from the provinces who comes to challenge the complacencies of Delhi's dynastic politics. He professes to dislike the big state and all its arms. He's described his goal as a, and I quote, minimum government with maximum governance. How he actually proposes to do that is unclear. It's also clear that he's happy to use state agencies for his own purposes when they suit him, to stalk particular individuals and so on. But what he promises is a strong style of decisive leadership, which in a sense, it's precisely designed to bypass what are seen as obstructive procedures or institutions or blockages in the system. And you know what he's also able to do is he's a consummate communicator certainly, but he's able to appeal to very different constituencies, to the business community who see him as focused on their interests, to those lower in the social order who see in him the story of the kind of rise, social rise. Kejriwal, or Arvind, as he's often referred to by journalists and so on. So on the other hand, stresses his purity and distance from politics. He leads a party obviously made up of non-politicians who claim they've come in to clean it. It's the very fact that they're not career politicians and that he isn't that's made them attractive to professionals. Unlike Modi, who vaunts his own personal abilities, Kejriwal says, and I quote, you know, I'm a small man, I cannot change this nation, but together we all can. It's not about me, it's about you. He insists he's not seeking power, he's fighting for justice to clear out corruption, but he's also, again, a masterful communicator. He can move, he can modulate from, in the course of a single answer to a question, from a kind of coy boyishness to kind of focused rage, and he can at once be intimate and a public orator. So Modi is devoted to politics, Kejriwal kind of disdains it. I think in their attitudes to sort of democratic institutions, they both style themselves as radical Democrats. Modi invokes a kind of majoritarian notion of democracy. Kejriwal prefers more really plebiscitarian, a referenda type democracy. Both are the important point I think is that for me is that both are dismissive of existing institutions. They, in Kejriwal's case, obviously wants to decentralize, wants to create other kinds of institutions about which he's not entirely definite about, but certainly there's this very clear rejection, and also a very clear rejection of the existing institutional routines. So I think even in the 49 days of the Delhi government, I mean, if you just consider the repertoire of techniques that were deployed, referendum by mobile phone, going to office on his first day by the metro, sleeping on the roadside, filing an FIR against India's richest man and a congressman. I mean, they're all designed to kind of say, you know, I'm not going to work with the existing patterns and institutions. They're very kind of public rejection of them. Both, I think, are also trying to frame the election as essentially a national one. To incite, if not a wave, at least a kind of wave-like effect that can sort of counter the regionalization of Indian politics that's occurred over the last 25 years. And here, I mean, I think something that's, again, well known, but comes into play. That in many ways, I think that the contest that's going to happen, although it's being set up at the national level as kind of Modi, Rahul Gandhi, Kejriwal, it's actually as much a contest between the national parties and the regional parties. That's the sort of other axis of contest. That the national parties themselves can no more hope to capture no more than about 300 seats, and the regional parties are certainly going to be in control of 200 plus seats. So I think there's a and the regional parties, in a sense, can also be seen in a functional sense as sort of outsiders to the ancient citadels of national politics, the institutions of central government. Let me just wind up. I'm going to drop some stuff because we're out of time. But so let me just come back to the institutional consequences of the developments I've very briefly outlined. I think we have plenty of evidence about the decline of the functioning of the legislative branch in Indian politics. Of institutions like Parliament, which parallel the intensifying democratization, the democratization processes. These two processes are nicely captured in an article in the current issue of Studies in Indian Politics by Rahul Verma and Vikas Tripathi, who note that what's distinctive about the decline of legislative functioning and the parallel expansion of democratic participation, what's distinctive about the Indian story in that case is that it's not occurring in relation to greater power being concentrated in the executive. That's not what's leading to the decline of the legislative. So what we're seeing, I think, is the attempt, through the intensification of democracy, minorities increasingly trying to block the functioning of Parliament, to stop majority-led legislation, in a sense to override a certain politics of numbers. Consequence has been an increasing resort to legislation by ordinance, or, of course, legislative inaction, which in turn has given greater scope to non-elected agencies to play that role, but has also made those non-elected agencies the objects of suspicion and criticism, the suspicion that they're overstepping their mark. Well, I'll actually stop there because I don't want to run into our restricted time. But
thank you, Sunil. Should you want to take it over?
Yeah, thank you, Tarun, for organizing this. I will combine two roles in my 20-minute presentation. My disciplinary home is political science, so I'll bring some democratic theory into this discussion. But I've also been a columnist now for 2 years, writing 20 columns a year, 20,000 words at least a year. So I'll also columnize and try and combine the two. And this is how I'll go. I will situate Indian elections in democratic theory, especially the more recent branch of it. And then I'll talk about what the big themes of Indian politics in the 20th century have been, the master narratives, and how the 2014 elections relate to those big stories, big themes, master narratives. Then I'll split the discussion into what should we expect the BJP to do. I'll do votes and seats for you. And I will also talk about the more important shifts that are taking place, some ideological shifts within BJP politics. I'll do the same for Congress Party. And in the last few minutes, I don't think I'll do all of AAP and all of regional parties. I will concentrate in the last 5 minutes on the Aam Aadmi Party, which its rise is stunning and its possibilities are immense. Long run possibilities are immense. Short run, we'll talk about the short run, the long run. So the first thing to note is the profound ambivalence of Indian democracy. gap between its electoral performance and its non-electoral performance, which is a key theme of my new book, which will be available after we're done. And the Coop has some copies out. We can go all the way back to John Stuart Mill in the 1860s to talk about why democracy was either undesirable or impossible in India. But let's not go all the way back there. Let's concentrate on the most recent version of it, version of democratic theory, Adam Przeworski at NYU. Quite stunning piece of statistical work, actually. Very, very evidence-based. I'll locate India into that larger framework. So it's an electoral wonder, but it's hugely deficient between elections. So there are two very different aspects emerging. During elections, even the most marginal citizen is courted. Turnouts, as Sunil noted, among the poor and the underprivileged have been higher than the middle class, the turnouts of the middle class and the rich since 89. 89 is a turning point. And that is actually a celebration of modern citizenship. Voting is an absolutely critical ingredient of modern citizenship. In pre-modern times, we didn't elect our rulers. That's not all there is to citizenship, though. Between elections, the powerful access the state, not the poor. The average citizen feels generally helpless unless mobilized and organized. And India turns from celebration of citizenship to celebration of clientelism. That's what happens between elections. There is one big mark on the way Indian elections function, that is campaign finance, which we can discuss at length if necessary, what the issues are. And otherwise, Indian elections today, you can't make the claim that Indian elections are stolen anymore. You cannot make the claim that providing blankets or saris or whiskey will allow you to win the elections, because everyone provides that. Right? So that's not the basis on which individuals vote. The poor acquire everything they can from all parties, and then they go according and vote according to their wishes. So, as a purely, whatever normative consideration we might wish to invoke on the question of provision, now of course the Tamil Nadu has perfected this art. It not only provides saris and whiskey, it also provides television and computers. All parties seek to provide television and computers. It actually is good for citizens. In many ways, it's very costly fiscally, but it's been managed in Tamil Nadu reasonably well. Now let's look at how Przeworski and others they have captured the debate, the modern debate on democracy, how they present the data. So Przeworski et al. The data set covers 141 countries between 50 and 1990. You can add more data to it. You can torture data after that. It will not change the basic conclusions. The basic conclusions hold. Some people have tried to add more data. Income is the best predictor of democracy. It was not this Mill argument. John Stuart Mill argument was India would not have a democracy because of its radical ethnic heterogeneity. Right? That was the Mill argument. Income is the best predictor now of democracy. If it correctly predicted the type of regime in 77.5% of the cases, only in 22.5% it did not. No other predictor, religion, colonial legacy, ethnic diversity, international political environment is as good on the whole. So the new statistical work says that John Stuart Mill was basically talking about 22.5%. Should we want to stretch him all the way to the late 20th century? India is in the latter 22.5% set. Indeed, if we consider only decolonized countries, democracies that emerged from decolonization survived only, we can make the claim even more specific empirically. Democracy survived only in India, Mauritius, Belize, Jamaica, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu. Wonderful list. This is, on the basis of statistics, this is the list where you can say democracy has lasted quite long. It has enjoyed longevity. The most surprising case is India. Quote, the odds against democracy in India were extremely high. There is a more humorous version of this argument in some of Przeworski's oral presentations, once he said the odds in India were negative. There's nothing called negative probability. The lowest is 0 and the highest is 1. So that's simply to say that it was very close to 0 if you go statistically. All other poorer exceptions that I noted had higher incomes than India. And he also notes, it's interesting for Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, if India is the biggest exception on the low income end, Singapore is the greatest surprise on the high income end. Singapore had the lowest probability of being undemocratic in 1990 when the data set ends, but it is authoritarian till today. Now, so that's the basis for the claim in the more statistically oriented, more modern discussions of democratic experience all over the world, that India is the most surprising exception to democratic theory and experience. Well, and theory and experience are connected here. But Przeworski's arguments are all based on elections. And those arguments have little to do with what happens between elections, including what happens in India's legislature, which was summarized by Sunil very well. And certainly the decline of legislatures that all of us have noted over the last 20 years, and the rise of non-elected institutions such as the Supreme Court and the Election Commission, two in particular, and widely viewed as being integrally connected to democratic longevity. Though I dispute that claim in my new book, but only partly. Okay, now, so that much about the new democratic theory. Now let's talk about the 3.5 master narratives of Indian politics, another key theme in the new book. The 3 master narratives are secular nationalism, Hindu nationalism, and caste-based injustice. Very much like if you read accounts of American politics, just as race, equality, and freedom have been the master narratives of American politics for 200 years. The 3 master narratives of Indian politics since the rise of Gandhi, at least, for almost 100 years, are these 3. They have provided enormous mobilization capacity, determined election calculations, made and unmade governments, especially on the national scale over the last 20-odd years. But there have been regional versions of it. Some of these narratives were regional, they become now national, especially caste, which was a South Indian regional narrative as early as 1930s. And it has become a North Indian narrative in the 1980s and 1990s. There's a 50-year lag between the North and South on caste. I'm not going to go into the details. This audience would know what the basic ideas of each of these master narratives are. I would not go into that. That will take us too far. Regionalism and language was expected in the 1950s to be a master narrative. Because of linguistic reorganization of Indian polity, this has ceased to be one. Language actually has led to very little violence in India since the late 1960s. Very little violence. One of the biggest predictions of the late 1950s, early 1960s was that language would break up India. Indeed, through linguistic reorganization, Indian polity has worked much better than even Nehru anticipated. He resisted the idea of linguistic organization to begin with and gave in as a liberal Democrat because that's what the nation wanted, he argued. In a society where until 10, 15 years ago, a majority of the population was poor, uneducated and unhealthy. Today, a majority is still unhealthy, but less than a majority, well, it's 25% now, illiterate, not 82% illiterate as at the time of independence. After 200 years of British rule, India had 18% literacy in 47, which has gone up to 73 now. By now, it should have risen faster. It should have been 100%, but we should note that in 1947, it was 18%. And the levels of poverty, we have data going back to 1951. At the very least, 50% of India was below the $1 a day poverty line. We extend the data. We can extend it from 61 to 47. And the inferences would be either 50% below $1 a day or as much as 2/3 of India below $1 a day in 47. So it was a desperately poor country and desperately illiterate country and desperately unhealthy. It's still fairly unhealthy. No, it's still not badly unhealthy, if not desperately. It is 25% illiteracy should be abolished, and Sen is right about that. And certainly the idea that 35, well, according to the government data, 25% is below $1 a day. And according to multi-dimensional Sen index, something like 40% below the, or 40 to 50% below the poverty line. That's all, these are all damning figures, and India has not done well. But the point is, if that much of India was unhealthy, uneducated, and poor, why did poverty, health, or education not become the master narrative of Indian politics? That is a question that we need to resolve. Some of us has proposed an idea, which is that there was a huge conjunction between poverty, illiteracy, and ill health on the one hand, and being lower caste, Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim on the other. The depth of mass deprivation was experienced through identity categories, not economic categories. A middle-class Dalit felt Dalit, not middle class. And a poor Brahmin did not share the feeling of being poor with the Dalit. He simply felt like a Brahmin. So that's the reason why you did not get, despite a majority being poor, etc., you did not get poverty, health, or illiteracy becoming the master narratives as a way to organize millions in politics. So what would Lok Sabha 2014 elections do to all this? And that's the question we need to ask in the remaining 15 minutes, remaining 12 minutes. To put it very simply, what will happen to religion and caste? Let's start with Hindu nationalism. The biggest issue on everyone's mind is what will happen to Mr. Modi and whether BJP will form a government in May. But for many of us, the question also is an equally important one. What does it mean? What do these elections mean for the ideology of Hindu nationalism? The BJP's strategy in these elections is not to broaden pre-election alliances. Rather, the reasoning is that a post-election alliance is perfectly within the realm of possibility, assuming a Modi-led BJP repeats its 1998 or 99 performance, winning 180 plus seats. You need 273 to form a government. If you get 180 on your own, you can put together the remaining 90, is the argument. The regional parties then will ally with the BJP. Today, the BJP has only 117 seats in parliament. When the BJP won 182 seats in 1998 and 1999, it captured 25.6 to 23.7, 25.6 and 23.7% of the national vote, respectively. In 2009, it had a mere 18.8, 19% of India's vote. 24 to 25% of the national vote is normally required. I can go into the calculations for those who are statistically minded, but I think that will take us too far. 24 to 25%, given a certain kind of distribution of that vote, is normally required for 180 plus seats. In short, Mr. Modi needs to deliver another 5 to 6 percentage points over the 19% that BJP got in 2009. In 2014, the size of the electorate is expected to be a little over 800 million. Assuming a 60 to 62% turnout, it could be higher. It was higher in November and December. It could be higher in May. But assuming a 60 to 62% turnout, which has been the pattern for 20 years, we'll have roughly 500 million voters. A 5 to 6% increase in BJP's vote essentially means that Mr. Modi will have to deliver an additional 25 to 30 million votes. Though polls in India have acquired a reputation for unreliability, that is all we have to base our pre-elections judgments on. It turns out that regardless of the polling agency, there is a consensus now which therefore bolsters predictions, which allows us to make predictions much more easily, regardless of the polling agency, regardless of the design. The best design is CSDS always. That may not still give you a good prediction because of some complications. Good predictions about seats, it almost always get predictions about vote percentage right. The statistically minded in India have tried very hard to come up with a conversion function. How to convert votes into seats, and there is no solution yet. Some very sophisticated econometricians have done this, and they are unable to come up with a conversion factor. And the reasons for that will need not detain us here, but I'll be happy to explain what the reasons are, why we can't get the conversion factor. But all of them are now, they have a consensus on 27 to 29%. This is quite interesting. 27 to 29% for BJP. That is higher than the 24 to 25% that is normally necessary for 180 plus seats. In other words, in all probability, though not in all certainty, BJP is headed towards the same number of seats that Congress had in 2009. Congress had 206 seats. Please note that because BJP vote is concentrated and Congress vote is distributed all over the country, typically BJP needs 1 to 2% less to generate as many seats as Congress does. So with 27 to 29, it can easily exceed the 206 seats that Congress had. It could get to 220. But the best thing is not to give you a point estimate, because no one can give you a point estimate. The best thing is to give you an interval estimate, which is now 180 to 210 as of now. 180 to 210. That essentially means Mr. Modi is now the front runner for the 214 elections and for the chance to form the government. It also means, analytically speaking, that Mr. Modi has heavily penetrated UP and Bihar on the one hand, and a large chunk of rural vote in each on the other, for a whole variety of reasons that most observers of Indian politics know. These three, UP, Bihar, and rural vote. Rural India is 68% of India still. Rural vote effectively 75% because urban India has voted less. So rural weight becomes 75%. Without these three, UP, Bihar, and rural vote, it is extremely hard for any party to get 27 to 29 to 30% of India's vote. In the 6 biggest states of India, UP, Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, West Bengal, Bihar, and Tamil Nadu, accounting for 243 seats in Lok Sabha out of 543, BJP has no significant presence in Andhra, Bengal, and Tamil Nadu. It splits half of Maharashtra. In UP, especially, the BJP declined over the last 10 years. UP was its stronghold in 1990s. Without a significant resurrection in UP, the BJP cannot get 27 to 29% vote, and all available surveys are showing that BJP has penetrated UP once again. Ideologically, that's this vote seat calculation. One thing ought to be noted right away about Mr. Modi's campaign over the last 7 months. Since the Kutta Pilla story, which was mid-July, when he gave an interview to Reuters, and he was rattled by the question about Gujarat 2002 riots, and English is not his first language, the question was asked in English. It became a story about when a puppy is crushed. He actually used the term pilla. He had to switch to Hindi because he couldn't answer it in English. Agar ek pilla ek car daba de or maar de, to dukh to hota hi hai. So if a dog or a puppy is crushed by a car, then if you are sitting at the back, as he was, you would still feel saddened by it. And I think it was an awful choice of words. But note that since then, there is no Hindu nationalism in his campaign. There are 2 aspects of Hindu nationalism that I will touch upon. One, of course, is anti-Muslim virulence, which is strikingly absent. It's 8 months now, strikingly absent, 7 months now. In the Bihar speech is worth revisiting, watching again and again, where he spoke about the relative prosperity of Gujarat Muslims and utter poverty of Bihar Muslims, and asked why that is so. I'll be happy to go into the answer he gave, which is very un-RSS-like. But the more important thing for me, as a student of Hindu-Muslim politics, was his blog on Maulana Azad, a great Muslim leader of India's freedom struggle. I don't know why it did not get much commentary in the press. When I read it on my way from Providence to Boston on the net, I was truly stunned by what the blog said. Mr. Modi wrote that Azad and Sardar Patel were two of the tallest leaders in modern India. For someone who was an RSS pracharak and who has always been viewed as a true Hindu nationalist, this is a truly monumental concession. I'm talking now ideologically. Making such concessions to Muslim is called the Vajpayee brand of Hindu nationalist politics. Out of pragmatism or a genuine ideological evolution since 2002, it is hard to tell which. Mr. Modi seems to be heading towards the moderate right part, not the ideologically pure segment of Hindu nationalism. The emphasis has been on governance and development, not on Muslims in India. And when Muslims he's talked about, it's with a soft touch, not with an RSS touch. To be sure, the struggle between the two tendencies within the party remains. Those local politicians of the BJP who were accused of fomenting anti-Muslim riots in Muzaffarnagar, I study these things and I've written about that. The more interesting thing was that those local politicians accused of fomenting those riots were hailed as heroes in UP, but not in a rally which Mr. Modi presided. Where his campaign goes next in the next few months, we don't know yet, but anti-Muslim rhetoric is not where it's likely to go. And we can get into the logic of why that is so. Basically, it is pointless, it's self-defeating for Mr. Modi to reinvent or reinvigorate discussion about 2002. It is best for him to put it behind. And it is best for his opponents not to reinvigorate it, to get it back in politics. His opponents will use 2002, and it is in his interest to put it behind. And I can go into why this is so. Another aspect of Mr. Modi's emerging emphasis is worth noting. That's the second part of ideological shift. He accepted an invitation. This is probably for the first time in the history of the RSS. From the Idava Sangam in Kerala 10 days ago. He talked of the social injustice of caste, and he used the term, he has often felt like a Dalit and being badly treated. Please note, the RSS argument about caste simply is either it does not exist or it is not a significant problem. And if at all caste injustice is to be, caste injustice quote unquote, is to be tackled, it is through Sanskritization. The term caste injustice is not used by RSS, it is Sanskritization of lower castes. There is an ideological tendency within RSS which is called the Govindacharya tendency, which we talked about social engineering. We can get into the details of that, I just don't have time for it. But the point here is that Sanskritization of lower castes is the standard trope in RSS arguments about how to bring lower castes into the Hindu fold. And for them, Mr. Modi was the classic example of that because Mr. Modi is an OBC. He is an OBC, he never emphasized caste, and there is a caste trope that emerged. You would not accept actually an invitation from an Idava Sangha. Idava community, you will not as an RSS pracharak. You simply will not. Yeah. Let's come to the Congress party. Not much needs to be said. A few things. The fire of anti-incumbency will consume Congress party in this election. The question really is how low it will go. Its lowest historically has been 112 seats. All available surveys are saying, once again, please remember, conversion factor is not perfect. All available surveys are beginning to show Congress declining below 100 for the first time. The ideological shifts are worth noting. Congress is no longer emphasizing secularism as its prime trope, at its primary introduction to India. It is reinventing itself as a party of social welfare. Because secularism as an ideology is frayed. It's been badly used. It doesn't go very far. It will come back if BJP rules for another 7-8 years. Then once again, its importance will be re-established. But as of now, because corruption, criminality, the more corrupt you are, the greater your inclination towards criminality, the more stridently you use the secular card. So secular card is no longer what you can present to Indian masses and believe it could win. But the more interesting thing is about Rahul Gandhi as a Nixon in China. I did say something about Mr. Modi also Nixon in China. I do believe Mr. Modi is seriously challenging the RSS now. That's why I'm using the term Nixon in China for him also. We can discuss it in Q&A. He is very seriously challenging the RSS now. Rahul Gandhi as a Nixon in China, this argument basically is that a dynast is saying, India's biggest dynasty now, is saying that it will introduce internal elections in the Congress party to reinvigorate the party. And if that leads to the dynasty being outvoted, so be it. So the dynasty saying, at least Rahul Gandhi version of it saying, we need internal elections, not only in the youth wings, where they have taken place. The youth wings of the Congress party are entirely elected. This was a prime principle of Congress organization after the rise of Gandhi in 1920, and it lasted till 1973. It regularly produced new leaders with legitimacy. There are no new leaders with legitimacy in the Congress party today. It's entirely dependent on the dynasty. And that can help in the short run, but cannot help in the medium to long run, especially because with the rise of urban India, the idea of dynasty is being increasingly questioned. In many cases, there is anger against it. Palpable, transparent anger against it. The last 1 minute, AAP. AAP is plugging into the argument. It's not that they listen to my argument, that's not why they plugged into it. But the argument that India's democracy functions well at the time of elections, but is hugely deficient between elections. And India's democracy has to be brought closer to its citizens between elections. That is the promise of AAP, right? And you can read Kejriwal's book. It's a pamphlet. As political pamphlets go, it's pretty interesting, right? It's not a discovery of India, but it's actually like Gandhi's pamphlet, 1909, Hind Swaraj. It's like that pamphlet, actually. So, and he's inspired by Gandhi too. Now, as far as the seat calculations go, this is the last minute. I've exceeded my time. As far as the seat calculations go, this is how it will work. India has 94 urban seats and 122 semi-urban seats. This is, at this point, an urban party. And in 2009, of the 216 urban and semi-urban seats, Congress won 95 and BJP won 55. And before the rise of AAP, it was expected that these proportions would at least be reversed. That BJP would get 95 to 100 and Congress would drop to 55 to 50. That is complicated by the rise of AAP. The rise of AAP can easily get 20 to 25 seats, mostly urban, but is also acquiring popularity in the hinterland, wrong term, in the rural electorate close to Delhi, which includes Haryana and Punjab. Actually, the surveys show now that in Punjab, it's going up to 20% of vote, and in Haryana, up to 25% of vote. It's a significant development. So you should not be surprised if AAP gets 20 to 30 seats. If it does, it will make it the third, fourth, or fifth largest party in parliament. And that will begin to change India's discourse very seriously, because it will be critical to all kinds of alignments. Let me stop there. Thank you. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you both of you. We have roughly 25 minutes left. I'll just make one comment. There were a couple of things that I found very striking. One aspect of each of your talks, and I just wanted to highlight it before we open it up, or maybe seek a comment from any of you. Sunil, I was struck by your comment early on in your remarks about the, shall we say, unbridled optimism of India's youth. And it's really striking, particularly in light of Ashu's provocative question why did anti-poverty not become a national narrative? Which is the ultimate failure in some sense, to me anyway, as someone not particularly steeped in political science, but looking at it as an economist and ultimately interested in economic development. Why is it that anti-poverty remains outside the bounds of discourse, in effect? And I'm wondering that ultimately this optimism, I would like to imagine, would still be tied in people's minds to the prospect of economic change and economic development and advancement, particularly amongst the youth. And if that's the case, it should be a harbinger of a change in political narrative. So I'm trying to tie in my mind this emergent optimism, which is ultimately what I find so exciting about India in a continuing sense, to this continued, dare I say, bankrupt discourse of caste and this and that, which doesn't really contribute or has not contributed historically to the advancement of the poorest sections of society. I'm trying to sort of reconcile these two things. So I'll just ask for a comment from either or both of you, and then just open it up to see where the discussion takes us. I mean, I find it supremely frustrating that there is no meaningful discussion of poverty even today. I mean, if you read any of these pamphlets or any of these manifestos, there really isn't a serious discussion of anything of that sort.
Would you like me to comment first, or?
Sure, go ahead, and then I'll comment. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I think, Tarun, to say that being Dalit or being OBC is less important than being poor would be a questionable proposition. I do wish that as a liberal political scientist, I do wish that there had been greater emphasis on education, health, and income poverty. And at one level, I share your frustration, I share Amartya's frustration with this. But if you read accounts of what Dalits were deprived of, and what, especially Dalits, but also lower OBCs were deprived of, then you can see why their politics was always defined not as politics of poverty, but as politics of dignity. This term appears again and again, Samman ki Rajniti. Treat me well. Treat me like a human being. Just because I'm a latrine cleaner or a street cleaner, that does not mean that I have no rights, that I couldn't be treated as a human being. So the first cry of those who were so deprived of dignity for centuries, the first cry was, treat me well, treat me with dignity, right? And actually, if whatever the failings of Indian democracy, the failings are many, and especially on poverty. In my book, I say this is the biggest failing of Indian democracy, an unsuccessful attack on poverty. But whatever the failings are, but the lower castes have risen in politics, and even Dalits have risen in politics to a very large degree. Now, this doesn't mean the Dalit injustice is gone. It's simply the case that you can no longer expect that you would expect a Dalit woman to walk topless, which is not, or force her to walk topless, and expect to get away with it. You might still want to force her to walk topless, but you may not be able to get away with it. There are parties available, there are organizations available that will catch you, right? So the so-called representative, as far as the representation of social groups is concerned in Indian politics, there is a remarkable change. Christoph Jeffel, who has a provocative phrase for it, he calls it actually an OBC revolution or Shudra revolution in Indian politics. The OBCs have taken over Indian politics. It's not absolutely precise, that phrase, but actually it substantially captures the reality, right? So I don't know what Sunil's view is, I wouldn't deny that gains of dignity, the dignity gains of Indian democracy are unsubstantial or insignificant. Of course, if the dignity gains, there had been gains in income poverty also, that would have been so much better. That position I take.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I find interesting is something that may be happening in how people perceive the rich in India. I think up to now, there's been very much a very positive perception of the very wealthy and of the wealthy, and because there's been, and I think that's been linked to what you were saying about the optimism, the sense that will be somehow at some point some entry point into some level of that. I think actually now, and that's why I found actually the you know, Kejriwal's going after you know, the one untouchable in India, Mukesh Ambani, actually very, very interesting, because it was the first time he was using this as a kind of popular form of appeal, and it may start to resonate, I think, and that I find very that may produce a very interesting shift, because up to now, I think there's been this, you know, the rich are like cricket heroes or Bollywood stars. You don't knock them because you imagine. Like you know, people in America, the 90% think they're going to be one day part of the 1% wealthy or whatever. There has been that kind of view, and I think that it seems to me there's a moment when we may be seeing a delegitimation of a certain kind of sort of, you know, capitalist processes in India, which may then therefore lead to issues of economic access and so on becoming much more electorally important. So I think that's again, you know, just trying to identify what I think is this very fluid moment at the moment. That's the thing that catches my eye, which is what I'd say.
I could also report the results of a new project in which I'm involved. There is no doubt that caste is weakening in urban India.
Mm-hmm.
There is no doubt about that. There is very interesting data, including on marriages now.
Yeah,
including on marriages.
So just the other thing, Joe. I mean, I think, you know, the way in which the sort of non-transparency of a whole series of pricings and so on in all kinds of areas of the economy, I think that is beginning to sort of drip into a popular imagination. That there are things that people feel, you know, belong to us, which are actually being scammed out of us, and that's I think a new sense.
Let's do the following. We'll need to have a little bit of discipline given the shortness of time and the extent of attendance. Shall we accumulate a few questions and then see whichever
Sure.
you wish to? Could you state your name, perhaps affiliation, and a question as opposed to?
Need the mic. We give them mic.
Sure. If you could pass it reasonably speedily, that would be most welcome. It's a collective action problem. Thank you. Yeah. Good.
Hi, my name is Dhruva. I'm a freshman at the college from Chennai.
Okay.
My question was this: given your discussion just now about Professor Khanna's question, Professor, I just wanted to know, holding economic development and ethnic dignity as commensurate ideals, assuming that's the case, how do you see the move? Do you see a movement of political discourse in India towards policies as opposed to personal issues and attacks? Like Modi keeps talking about the Gujarat model of development. I have no idea what the Gujarat model of development is, and I had no idea that that the Congress wanted to move towards like primary-based ideals. Till Rahul Gandhi mentioned in his interview. So, do you see political discourse moving towards discussion and policy, or do you still have it firmly based on ideology and personal attacks?
Okay. Anybody else on this side while we have the mic here? Okay. Toss it across to this side. Let's not wait. Why don't you speak loudly? Yeah.
Okay. Ashu, my name is Sridhar, and I had the decision of standing for the 2013 assembly elections in Karnataka and got 6% votes. I can definitely agree with you on the importance of caste and dignity. Having won votes across all castes. My question to you is, what weakened Mayavati, and is Modi more likely to benefit from Mayavati's failure in this election? That's one part of the question. The second is the urban electorate, as you said, is in the range of 25 to 30 seats. But when I see the elections on the ground,
50 to 30.
15,
30 is much too precise.
Sure,
I think
I agree.
that kind of precision you can't have.
I agree. But what I saw in the Lok Sabha campaign, where we put 24 candidates in Karnataka as a state, as compared to AAPs contesting the Delhi thing, I think there is a network effect. We failed to gain that network effect, and we were in the 6 to 10% range as Lok Sabha. But AAP ended up getting the critical mass of 25% above.
30%.
30% above. So is geography and spread, the concentration is going to benefit AAP outside of Delhi?
One more question, then we'll ask our panelists too.
Wonderful debate.
State your name.
Amit Kenodia, Lincoln Ventures, affiliated with Harvard for a long time. The regionalization of India's national politics, Hindi belt versus non-Hindi belt, and the concentration of electoral votes in Hindi belt. All the indications are UP, that BJP will do very well. Some reflection on that, if we still have a heavy-handed caste and family-based voting in Hindi belt, which is a lot heavier than the rest of the country. Thank you.
Sunil, any subset of those?
Well, okay, just on the last, I mean, yes, the one thing it's apparent in this kind of, this contest between the national parties and the regional, again, as we know, the national parties, the two national parties that have really functioned up to now have been gaining over now 2 decades less than 50% of the national vote share. So actually more than half of India is voting for regional and caste parties. That's absolutely likely to continue again this time. So when we refer to them as the regional parties, there's a kind of something wrong with our lens. Because these are, I mean, this is the content of national democratic politics, more than half of the content of national democratic politics. And I guess what interests me is how are these fragmented regional parties going to be part of a legislative process in which they don't feel they really have a voice, because they're always going to be small. And in the legislative process, the Indian Constitution doesn't make much use of supermajorities. Right? It's actually very easy to do a whole variety of things with simple majorities. So the supermajorities are in a sense a protection for minorities. And so moving into the phase that we're in now, it seems to me that and we can come back to the preponderance of the Hindi belt. There's also an interesting question there about demography and seats, which we can come back to. But essentially, if we're moving into a situation where these regional state minority parties basically want to stop a lot of what is happening, their only resort is by doing what we saw last week, in a way. So going back to this question of are we moving from persons and ideologies to policies, I wish, but and a lot of the talk has been are we moving away from a politics of identity to interests and so on. But I think we're also moving into a situation where the given institutional order is going to find it very hard to work with the kind of sort of configuration that we have of votes, and so whether this the outcomes will produce a more effective form of legislation, I wonder. So that's a kind of somewhat roundabout way, but I hope you. And in terms of the predominance of UP and the Hindi belt, again, let me take an example. For example, in the 1980s, when you had a kind of centralization of power, but you also had this sense in a number of different states that they were essentially being disenfranchised from political decision making. So Punjab, Assam, later Kashmir. In each of those cases, what happened was a kind of cycle of violence, where that was the only way in which you could sort of disrupt federal functioning. And I think we're now possibly moving in, it's not going to be the same, because I don't think it's going to be violent, but there are going to be other ways in which these fragments are going to try and get their voices heard.
Any subset of those?
I think personalities will always be important. I think your question was not about that. Your question was whether there will be greater focus on policies now. And India comes back to policies periodically in the national election. But I do think there is greater seriousness about policy now. And the reason simply is that, I mean, think of Congress Party, you can't say the Gandhis vote for us. So you have to, it has had to reinvent, no, it had to de-emphasize secularism, is de-emphasizing dynasty. It's talking about a social, it's becoming Labour Party of India, right? That is its vision now, that we are the party of the poor and the underprivileged, right? So we have all these legislations, and legislations are not working, at least in urban India. Nobody's responding well to them. So, but that's a policy seriousness. The space is being created for that because older ideas are not working. Mr. Modi's lack of embrace of Hindu nationalism, would I have predicted that in July? No. I wrote a piece saying it would be very hard for him to put together the extra 30 million votes. He's probably putting together 40 million plus. And the reason has not been Hindu nationalism, the reason is governance and development. That is the theme, right? Now, and there are certain policies that will come with it, we can discuss that, but the theme is governance and development. That is the main theme. And Aam Aadmi Party, it's been very theatrical actually. It's not talked about governance deficit, which is the argument of Mr. Modi. It's talked about democratic deficit. Democratic deficit is the idea you should bring democracy closer to the people. Governance deficit is the idea. That's not the argument that Mr. Modi is making. Mr. Modi is saying, I will do it from the top. I will reform governance from the top. He's not talking about bringing democracy closer to the people, right? So these are two different arguments about the deficit. Governance deficit is not what Kejriwal is talking about. If you see his last two interviews, he says, what is governance? Tell me. So it's very theatrical about reaching out to the Mohalla Sabhas, which is actually a good idea. But having a state assembly meet in a stadium, right? Or the idea of weekly assemblies, which had to be dropped because there was a stampede. It could have actually led to some deaths and would have permanently buried the idea of weekly assemblies with the people, right? So this idea that he has from Swiss democracy, in his book he talks about how Swiss democracy is the model, where citizens can change this, can change that, can put things on the agenda. With so many thousand votes, they can force the legislature to act, right? So his model is Swiss democracy, and he writes about that in the book. Switzerland is 8.2 million people. Delhi is 18 million. So how are you going to work with the Swiss model? He's not asked that question. So the solutions that he's proposing about bringing democracy closer to the people are all half-baked, right? But these are no longer arguments about caste. In fact, AAP is not about caste and religion. It is about democracy deficit of India. So I think there's greater seriousness. Is North India more caste-oriented than South? Yes. South has gone through a revolution, North has not. A caste revolution.
So open it up. Is somebody in the back? I can't see you. Is it at the back, at the very far back, near the camera?
My name is Sharik and I'm from law school. My question is with regard to minorities because you said that BJP is heading our leading party in North, and we see that Muslims constitute a greater portion of the electorate in those states like UP, Bihar, Bengal, and they send almost a good number of MPs. So, and they have never historically voted in favor of BJP. And if you look at Mayawati's constituents, lower class, OBC or scheduled caste, they have also been, they have never supported historically BJP. And at the same time, if you look at Mulayam Singh's and the other local parties like Nitish Kumar and Mamta, so this all leaves a very small portion of electorate winnable for available for BJP thing. So how do you think it can work well for BJP, at least in the north?
I think you sort of answered this, but do you want to?
Let's just concentrate on UP for a moment, right? Yeah. I think you have asked a very big question, a very important question. So UP is seen as, if you talk to a strategist, when he's sitting in the war room, UP is 20, 20, 20, 40. What does it 20, 20, 20, 40 mean? UP is 20% Muslim, plus minus, 20% Dalit, 20% upper caste, and 40% OBC. Right? So the BJP, in the BJP war room, if you talk to these guys, how are they thinking about that? They can ignore the Muslim vote. Right? You can say it's dangerous, but you know, let's look from their perspective. All they need is a large chunk of upper caste vote, and they need to penetrate the OBC, it's 40%. Right? In a multi-party electoral space, where you don't need 50% to come to power, not even 40% now, all you need is around 28 to 30%. 20% of upper caste and 40% of OBC, 60%. If you get half of that, you are in power in UP, right? So now this is of course disturbing from the perspective of Muslims. This is extremely disturbing that they can be ignored in some ways. But the hard reality of UP politics is, yes, they can be, so long as OBCs can be penetrated. And that's the BJP strategy.
So, let's take two more questions. I want to reserve the last question for myself. Fine. Go ahead, ma'am. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Vanya. My question is just how, in the past years, compared to past years and past elections, how have you seen a change in the way that the Indian media is covering the elections, and whether there's any, because I've been closely following it myself, and I'm curious to know where you both may see a gap in coverage, whether there's too much, because I've seen a lot of coverage of Aam Aadmi, but I don't know, yeah, so I'd be curious what your reflections are on the Indian media.
Okay, thank you. There's a question here somewhere. Yeah, go ahead. Just shout it out.
Yeah, well, kind of related to that. I mean, the media has talked a lot about, oh, sorry, my name is it okay without the mic?
He needs it for reception.
Gotcha, okay.
Your voice is very reassuring and resounding. So.
Thank you. My name is Dinyar Patel. I'm a PhD candidate here at Harvard. My question was, I mean, the media has talked a lot about, say, the swelling support of, say, the middle class and maybe even the upper classes for things like AAP and BJP. Do you see this election as a turning point in terms of middle class and upper class voter turnout increasing, or is it well and true done? Does it even matter anymore?
Okay, well, I just wanted to make one point which sort of picks up on something I was trying to say earlier, and also came out in something Ashutosh just said. I mean, I think, you know, what was going back to what do the emergence of Modi and AAP mean for India's constitutional democracy and for the institutions of that. I mean, it seems to me that, you know, what someone like Kejriwal is pushing in this message of decentralization is the kind of sovereignty of local bodies. What Modi is pushing in his kind of, you know, I am the person who will make things happen, is really the sovereignty of his own person. And both of those seem to me completely contrary to the whole institutional architecture that India established in 1950 and subsequently. So I think there is a really big question about, and again, I think, you know, I'm focusing on those two not just because they're two striking individuals, but I think they actually are speaking to something that's going on in the democratic process, which actually we really have to notice if we're thinking about the future workings of India's institutions of constitutional democracy. There's something happening which I think is just not mapping on to how those institutions. So the idea that somehow they're going to get back into good functioning order simply on the next election is, I think, something we may all be putting ourselves up for disappointment for. So that's just kind of one thing I want to say. I mean, on the greater participation of the middle classes, and I think certainly that is, we are seeing that. I mean, AAP has certainly done that. I mean, one thing that we haven't talked about, and which I think is actually one of the most striking things about AAP, is that it's shown a different way of funding elections. Something that has been a real kind of block and puzzle for political parties up to now in India. How do you fund an election without having to go through all the other mechanisms that the existing parties have? AAP have actually shown that. and they are drawing in people who would never. They've lowered the barrier for entry into politics, which up to now has been really, really hard and high for people who want to go into politics. And so now actually there's a kind of way of coming in which just has not really been opened up before. And I think that's a very very striking thing to notice about it. Whether or not it succeeds beyond this next election doesn't really matter. But again, what it's shown is that it's possible to do that. So I just wanted to put those. I'm afraid I haven't really answered the questions that were raised just now, but I just wanted to put those in.
On the media, simply the following. I do a lot of television. I notice how they act, and essentially the media was very pro-Congress until it became impossible to hold that line, right? Then it became fascinated with Kejriwal because there's something fascinating about an outsider swinging the doors of power open, right? Something fascinating about that. Something fascinating about the fact that middle classes were joining. But Kejriwal's, and theatre is also meant for, the idea of a chief minister sleeping on the sidewalk with a quilt wrapped around him on a very cold Delhi winter night, temperatures dropping to 2 Celsius, right? This is brilliant theatre at one level. This is truly brilliant theatre. But the one qualification I would add to what Sunil has said is that the upper middle class and the middle class in general, they're beginning to have doubts about AAP. And its base among the urban poor and lower middle class is widening. This theatrical politics works extremely well. And you imagine, the chief minister sleeping on the sidewalk, on a cold winter night. So, and other things, challenging the police, that works extremely well, right? Challenging the police, and even the idea of state assembly meeting in Jawaharlal Nehru Stadium or Talkatora Stadium, that's a pretty, this theatrical politics, it violates several rules of governance, that's a different point. But so as of now, it appears to be the case that AAP's base is widening, but that is primarily among the urban poor and the lower middle class. The middle class enthusiasm, and especially the upper middle class enthusiasm, for AAP is beginning to wane because this is disturbing. The FIR against Mukesh Ambani and whatever you think, it's I think going to be popular at one level, but it's going to be extremely unpopular because that case was in court. And you don't violate the integrity of a judicial process by issuing an FIR while it's being heard. And it's coming up actually for judgment in about 4 weeks. So it will be very popular at the lower social strata, but all kinds of questions have emerged in the quote-unquote middle class.
We're out of time. Personally, I find 2 ideas really very, very exciting. One, this notion that I started off with, trying to provide a bridge between the talks, which is it going to be the case that I have no problem with dignity being the animating idea for a large percentage of the population. At some level I can relate to it, and some level I probably couldn't. But the idea that it's sort of what an economist would call a corner solution, which is that it's the only thing that matters, to the exclusion of economic advancement, is a genuine puzzle for me. And I don't really see the evidence, even though Modi talks about governance and so on. I don't see the evidence that the conversation has moved in that direction, AAP notwithstanding.
No, Tarun, I think there is, at least in urban India, the rise of so-called aspirational India. I don't think there's any doubt left anymore about that.
That would be great.
Yeah, and that will go in your direction.
And
go in my direction too. I mean, it's not.
And the AAP thing, I think, as Sunil just said, the exciting thing about AAP is that it just happened, regardless of the outcome. The de novo entry has been established as a principle, which is an exciting prospect, regardless of what happens going forward. Please join me in thanking the panelists. We will